Mary Sue Hubbard, the wife of Scientology founder and Commodore L. Ron Hubbard, was loyal to him up until the day she died in 2002. This is part 2 of our stories about Mary Sue Hubbard. My co-host, Janis Gillham Grady, was very close to Mary Sue over the years, and she told a lot of stories in part 1. But in part 2, she's going to continue and tell some other personal stories about Mary Sue Hubbard. We're going to go into detail about Operation Snow White, which was the largest infiltration of the United States government in the 1970s, and her conviction and what happened afterwards after she got out of prison, all the way until she passed away. I think you're going to find these stories interesting and informative. We hope you enjoyed this video about Mary Sue Hubbard. This is part 2. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our channel again, Scientology, Peeling the Onion. I'm here with my co-host, Janis Gillham Grady. How you doing, Janis?
Good, Mark. Good day, everyone, and welcome to Scientology, Peeling the Onion. Today is part 2 of our episode talking about Mary Sue Hubbard. And I want to, if I look down, it's because since the last time we did this interview, I've had some thoughts and memories, and I'm like, oh, I better note that down and tell that story. So if you see me looking down, it's because I'm trying to remember some things I forgot in the earlier part.
That's right. And then also we're going to be basically telling about her final years all the way up until she passed away in the same way, 2002. I've got some notes written down too. And then also I've got some details about what she was convicted of in the Snow White, Operation Snow White with the federal government. So I'm going to be reading off on some of that stuff too, but we want to be as accurate as we can. So don't mind us looking down and reading.
Okay. So let me start off with when we were living in Tangier, Morocco, and this was in the end of 1972, and Hubbard took off out of Morocco. But while we were living there, Mary Sue had an office, and she decided to learn French. So anytime we'd go downstairs, you could hear the French record playing and Mary Sue repeating all the words, and then she'd walk around the house doing things, trying to remember her different words, French words. Because in Morocco, they spoke a lot of French and Spanish, along with Arabic, of course. So anyway, it was always just interesting to see her trying to learn the language. But while we were living in Tangier, we had a cook called Mary Chambers, I think it was. And we had the Hubbard steward was Andre Tabayoyan, and they started dating while we were there, or just before. And when Hubbard needed to leave in an emergency from the villa in Tangier, because of his interference with the Moroccan government, and it was now exposed, and it was like, get Hubbard out of here. So Andre drove LRH down to Casablanca, and while they're at a hotel down there in Casablanca, they got a room together, and while Andre was in the bathroom getting ready for bed, he comes out and he sees that Hubbard had put a chocolate on his bed and pulled it back and had it all prepared for him, just the way he would have done it for him.
Uh-huh.
So that was just kind of a cute memory of Andre as Commodore steward, and the Commodore reversed it on him. Anyway, Andre was at the point now he could get on that next plane to Lisbon with Hubbard, or come back and join us up in Tangier where his fiance was. So Andre talked to Mary Sue, and Mary Sue was like, Andre, if you want to continue your relationship with Mary, you should come back. It's up to you to decide. And so Andre, having Mary Sue's blessing, put Hubbard on the plane and went back. And then when we all went back to the ship later on, Mary and Andre got married, and she passed away several years ago, but they were loyal to each other to the
They
end.
were lifelong partners. I mean, I remember, Andre and Mary, and then their son Casavius. You know what I mean?
Yes.
They were together for years and years until she passed. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, so I just thought, that was also something of Mary Sue's, where she liked to keep couples together. She loved weddings. That's the wedding reception when Annie got married to Charlie, and that was LRH and Mary Sue giving a toast to the couple.
Yeah, we're talking about Annie Broker. Hold on, we're talking about Annie Broker, who got married to Charlie Rush at the time. So she was Annie Rush and Charlie Rush. Anyway, go ahead.
Right. Maiden name Annie Tidman, and Annie was a fellow messenger with me, and she's the one who went with Hubbard when he went into the final seclusion. Well, here's where her daughter Diana, the oldest, got married. There's Hubbard on the left, and then Mary Sue, Diana, John Horwich, the groom, Suzette Hubbard, Diana's sister, and Alan Buchanan is the best man. And Mary Sue got very involved in that, and Sylvia Calhoun took all the photographs of that wedding, and Mary Sue sent her a lovely letter, thank you letter for all the photos that she did. And after the wedding, a lot of the crew went ashore to a restaurant for a celebration, the wedding reception. And you can see here, I'll go from the left to right. There's Quentin Hubbard in the back there, and in front of him is Arthur Hubbard, Archie. And then Diana is in the blue gown. That was the bride. And then John Horwich, the groom. And then Mary Sue's the one with her arms up like this. And L. Ron Hubbard, and then Nikki Merwin, Nikki Freeman at that time, Mary Sue's communicator, and like Mary Sue's best friend. They were inseparable. And they were watching there was Moroccan dancers, and there was snake charmers and stuff like that at the wedding reception. There's different photos of her socializing with the crew, and just sitting around chatting. There's a photo of her. Her steward at that time, Vicki Berman, is there on the right. Behind her is Ken Urquhart, and then Tony Dunleavy, Jill Gleason, and Robin Roos. And even at the different parties and even wedding receptions with the dancing going on, if one of the male crew went over to Mary Sue, even if she was standing with Hubbard or sitting with Hubbard, and asked her to dance, she would get up and she would dance with them. Hubbard didn't get up and do any dancing anymore. Right. But, if one of the guys did, like Stu Moreau, Stu would always go and ask her to dance, and she would get up and dance with them. She enjoyed those parties. Yeah. So that's kind of just more about what her personality is. And back at St. Hill, I remember sometimes I'd show up on the weekend. I'm like, okay, I'm here to play. Where are the Hubbard kids? And they wouldn't be there, because every weekend, Mary Sue in her little red Mini Minor would drive into East Grinstead and go to the magic shop. And she would get magic, mostly for Arthur's sake. He was the youngest, and he was big on magic and dinosaurs at that time. So she would take him there, and then she'd take the kids shopping for whatever they needed. And speaking of shopping, when there was going to be a big convention in Los Angeles that Diana and Quentin was to be the guest speakers at, and they'd never done an event before. They'd been living on the ship, in our small little world. And the clothes they had were kind of like sealed clothes or, some jeans, nothing really nice. So Diana, with her mom, flew to Zurich, and Mary Sue went and got her some gowns for that event, so that she would be, it was like her
coming out party.
Coming out party when she, getting a gown and, going to Los Angeles to do these big events. And then later on in the years, Arthur and Suzette went and did events with them. And the family Christmas card would be pictures of the kids, the Hubbard kids, to go out.
Now, just to carry on, through the timeline or whatever. Now, Mary Sue basically, like when you guys went across the Atlantic to the Caribbean, or the Apollo was in the Caribbean, Mary Sue continued on the ship with Hubbard, right? And she still was running the Guardian's office during that time period.
Yeah, she was, from day one all the way through she was. And even when we were in Madeira and we had the rock festival where the locals came and were throwing, bringing taxi loads of rocks in and throwing them at us, I was on Liberty that day, and so was she. And she was actually in town with Nikki and Diana. And I remember as I'm walking back towards the ship, some of the crew coming up and saying, "Have you seen Mary Sue? We're trying to find Mary Sue. There's people throwing rocks at the ship. We're all going to meet up at the Sheridan." And so I went up to the Sheridan, and these men went off looking for Mary Sue and then got Mary Sue up to the Sheridan to join us. And we, were up there in the nightclub trying to pretend nothing was going on, and we'd keep looking out the window to see if our ship was still there. And then we see the ship, pulling in the lines and sailing out to, and I was like, oh no, but they were just going out to anchor. And then, once it was safe and the dock was cleared, Mary Sue and all of us would then walked down to the ship and took the launches, the boats, back out to the ship.
Now, was Mary Sue's car thrown into the ocean?
Yes, Mary Sue's car was thrown
by the rioters.
Yeah. Well, we had Mary Sue's car and motorbikes, different crew motorbikes, all on the dock. And so, the locals, as part of their throwing rocks, took the motorbikes and were dumping them in the harbor. And Mary Sue's Mini Miner, the one that she used to drive in England, which was now used on the ship, used mostly by external communications and the ship's rep office to do little errands and stuff. And it was dumped into the harbor as well.
Did she end up getting another car once after that incident, or what?
No, she didn't. I remember Bert Rousseau, who was Hubbard's transportation at one point. He was working on getting all the dents out of it and doing all the body bonding on it. I was just going to mention, family time with the Hubbards. It used to, dinner time and breakfast and, was always Mary Sue and Hubbard. And one of the stewards at the time later said, why aren't the children being included? So it's a family dinner every dinner time. So she got Hubbard's permission to invite the kids. And so Diana, Suzette, Quentin, and Arthur would join them for dinner. And then when Diana got married to John, John would join them. And I used to hate those family dinners because different things around, there'd be different discussions about what was happening around the ship. And Hubbard might yell, "Messenger," and we'd have to run in there. And everyone's staring at you, and you get the message and you go off. And when you come back, they're all staring at you to listen to what your response is. And it just was uncomfortable. But anyway.
Did you get along with all of the kids on the ship? Yes,
I got along with all of them. Yeah, even Quentin, how old was I at the time? I think I was probably 16 and he was 18. And he was telling me that, if I have to get married to anyone, there's only 2 girls on this ship that I would marry. And I'm like, oh, who's that? And he says, you or Annie. But that never happened. And Quentin, I really like Quentin. Very gentle personality, very gentle soul, and very friendly. And he used to pretend to be an airplane. He'd always wanted to be a pilot, and he'd fly down the passageways, the corridors of the ship. He'd fly as if he was an airplane. But he had a girlfriend on the ship, and she lived with him for probably a good year.
Because of your relationship to Hubbard as a messenger, did the kids look at you, like Hubbard's kids look at you as like, we better not say too much to Janis or the other messengers because they may tell our dad? You know what I mean? Like, did they ever feel like, they couldn't really trust you not to rat them out on things?
No, I don't think so. I mean,
You know what I mean? You're teenagers,
yeah, yeah. But Suzette used to be a messenger,
Yeah.
and she didn't like being a messenger, so she asked to be transferred. So she went to the decks and she became the quartermaster, and so she would clean the bridge and polish the brass and do all that kind of stuff. But that was her choice, you know. But she still hung out with us. And Arthur was much younger than us. But as he got older, you know, he started hanging out later on with my brother. And, you know, we joked around with Arthur. He was closer in age to my sister-in-law, Doreen, that we all called her Doe. And I will never forget the time Doe and he and a bunch of other kids were all down in Hold 1 hanging out. And there was hammocks down there, and there was mattress storage and other storage, crew storage. And Doe had been laying on a hammock, and Arthur dumped her out of it, and she couldn't move. And they ended up having to call an ambulance. We were in Safi, and they called an ambulance, and Doreen had to be lifted out of the hold by the crane. So now that involved now taking the hatches off the hold and lowering the crane and putting her on a stretcher to lift her up and lower her down to the ambulance. And when Hubbard found out about this, oh, no one wanted to be around. He was so mad at Arthur. I mean, he was ballistic. And, and he didn't talk to Arthur on a regular basis or see him and have a family time. And, he didn't do that. But so here he was now just nailing the kid for, he did something stupid. And it caused damage to someone, but it was rough for everyone to watch.
Let me ask you this. Do you think that the kids ever felt neglected by LRH because he was constantly working and didn't have a lot of time for them?
Yeah, I do think so. I mean, I went through the same thing. But, and talking about the kids, there was a time, when Quentin took some pills. And Hubbard found out, and he went down there and got him to spit up the pills and so forth. And Mary Sue came down. And this was right around the beginning of the RPF being set up. And at that point, after the emergency was handled, Hubbard was like, Quentin is to go to the RPF. And Mary Sue was like, no, I will handle it. I will audit him myself. I will deal with this so that he doesn't have to go to the RPF. And Hubbard would know he is going to the RPF. He's getting no special treatment. He needs to get his case fixed. So Quentin ended up going to the RPF, and he twinned with Kathy Kurataki. But that was Mary Sue trying to be mother and protect her son, and Hubbard was not going to take it.
So Mary Sue looked out for the kids much more so than Hubbard did, I take it, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, she was very protective of her kids. If she knew there was an issue, she was there for them.
Right.
And
like
she used to go on.
She defended Arthur about the Vixie incident that we talked about last time and went after you.
That's right. And I also went with Paul Preston. She went after Paul Preston, too, with the whistle. So, yeah, she was very defensive of her children.
Yeah.
Now, any good mother would be.
Now, when you guys came ashore in Daytona and then eventually ended up in Clearwater, and then Mary Sue, did she pretty much stay with Hubbard, like whatever location he was at, unless he went off to like New York or Washington, D.C.? Was she pretty much in the same location as him?
Yeah, let me go into why we moved off the ship and what happened there. Okay. Mary Sue had some physical issues, and but in addition to that, Hubbard always wanted to give her a home, not be on the ship where, she had her little office and her cabin and the lounge dining room, and that was it. That was the only space she had, and she just worked all the time. Mm-hmm. And he always wanted a space for her to be comfortable and have as a home. not have to live on a ship. So that was one thing that he said was why we were moving off the ship. But Mary Sue, we'd just gone through a whole thing with Hubbard being in hospital. And I know I've covered that before when we were in Curacao. We had an emergency and he went to hospital and he was there for a while. And so Mary Sue's thoughts were, well, what if we're at sea and he has a heart attack? You know, what would we do? So that's where she was like, hey, we need to move ashore so that we're not at sea if something happens. Mm-hmm. And so then she and Hubbard started planning it, and she used the Guardian's office to do a lot of the planning. And so her and Hubbard coordinated very closely with missions being fired out. And, you know, we had missionaries, like even Nikki Merwin was on the missions, and Frankie Friedman. And, you know, they had to go and find a hotel in the U.S. where there was near a international airport. So, you know, they were going to North Carolina, South Carolina, Florida, you know, and it just so happened that there was a hotel in Clearwater. Well, everyone liked the name Clearwater. So, and that was the Fort Harrison. And there was also half a block away was the Clearwater Bank building.
Right.
So the mission reports up, yes, it's an international airport. We've got this 10-story hotel and we've got a 2-story bank building. This is perfect. And we'd never fill it. I mean, there was so much space. Mm-hmm. So Hubbard went ashore. He flew with Kimmer to America and went up to Daytona, where the Guardian's office and the missionaries had already set that up at the Neptune Inn in Daytona. And then Mary Sue flew in with Nikki, and they went up there. And next to the Neptune Inn was a tall condo, a round condo building. I looked for it when I was there a few years ago. I didn't find it. But mm-hmm. He had a room up there, an apartment, and everyone else was at the Neptune or at the, everyone called it the Sheep Dip Hotel. But so they lived in the condo and the crew were down at the Sheep Dip and the Neptune. And she didn't go down there. She just stayed and worked, and Nikki would go up and, you know, work with her up there in the condo. And from there, that condo is where Hubbard was sending out the different missions to now set up the Fort Harrison, to close escrow, to get the cash, you know, to do the space planning, which Hannah, David Mayo, and myself did, to set up the penthouse for him. You know, it was just all these different missions now, doing everything to take control of these 2 buildings. And meanwhile, there was crew left on the ship to close up the ship. And even Mary Sue Stewart was there closing up the ship. And then, you know, it was the first people off were the non-Americans, because it was easier to get them off first, and they come through with the short story that our ship is under renovation, so we're coming to America for a vacation. And that's why there were so many of them. And then once the ship was sold, all the Americans came, or as the refit was done, the Americans came and left a skeleton crew of about 8 people on board until it got sold. But the Americans were pretty much, they're just coming home. So the GO didn't worry about what kind of PR story or short story they were going to tell. So when we got to Daytona and we were doing all this work to get the Fort Harrison and the CB ready, that's when the Guardian's office said, well, you shouldn't, Hubbard and Mary Sue should not go to the Fort Harrison yet until things are settled down. So that's when they found King Arthur's Court. And we did a video on that. So
that's right,
Mary
a year
Sue
ago,
Yeah. So Mary Sue and Hubbard were at King Arthur's Court in Dunedin with the household unit and the messengers. And life just continued with the 2 of them. And the children were mostly at the Fort Harrison because they had regular regular jobs.
Yeah.
Yeah. And and Diana was an aide. And so she was there at the Fort Harrison. And Suzette was in marketing, so she was over there, or she was in AVC at that time. Arthur became an artist. But Arthur was in LRH Transportation. Anyway, so the family kind of was, they'd see each other, but not a lot. And it was just Hubbard and Mary Sue. And then when it was exposed that Hubbard was there, he took off with Kimmer and Mike and left Mary Sue. And Mary Sue took over running things at UCE, United Churches Extension. And so she ran things, and he would do mail packs with her. So anything coming from him when he was in DC would go to Mary Sue, and then she would gather all the mail for him.
When he left King Arthur's Court, because you and I were just there a year ago to check it out and all that, did she stay living there even though the reporter had found the location, or did she have to relocate herself as well?
No, she stayed living there. We had a 6-month lease. So she stayed living there. And then meanwhile, while he was in DC, he was working to try and find a place out in California. And then the Guardian's office found an apartment building. And so they rented that. There was like 2 or 3 units that they were able to get.
Right.
And so Mary Sue, when Hubbard was coming out from DC, she came out from Clearwater, and they met at the apartments and were staying there together along with a small crew. While Hubbard was there in Los Angeles area, the Guardian's office were working to find a house for them to live and where we can have an operation. And that's when they found the La Quinta properties, which became known as Winter Headquarters, or SU for Special Unit, or Over the Rainbow. And the house purchased for Hubbard and Mary Sue was Rifle.
Right, called Rifle.
And so, right. So once they moved from the LA apartments, they moved to Rifle. And everybody else moved over, and there'd been crew being pulled up from Clearwater to go to SU in order to renovate it and prepare it for Hubbard, or for, more people to come and expand. And
so Mary Sue finally had a house together with Hubbard, if you think about it.
She did.
It was a nice house. It wasn't big, but it was nice, right?
Yeah, she had an office. He had an office. Nikki had an office. The Messengers had an office. Yeah, and a swimming pool. And then there was a guest house, which had 2 rooms and a kitchen in the middle. And the sad thing about it was the Messengers, when Hubbard was sleeping, the Messengers would sit in the kitchen. So Mary Sue had no privacy. She just would come and go to her room. She couldn't use that kitchen. She couldn't go in and visit her husband, and go chat with him because there's Messengers sitting there. And I know she hated it. Yeah. You could just pick that up. And she, she was out to go see him in his office anytime she wanted, and they had dinner together. And then when and she didn't wander around WHQ really. She might pop down and see her assistants or deputies, Ann and Jimmy Mulligan and Fred Hare, that were down at one of the properties. But she mostly stayed in her office, and they would go up and see her. And Nikki lived up there as well, so she would just go see Nikki. But then when the FBI raided the manor and the complex, and word got on that, Hubbard split right away.
This is part of the Snow White, where the FBI, Michael Meisner, who had been being held prisoner by the Guardian's office because he got caught and arrested and whatever, and then they kept him away from the government. They didn't want him going to the government and testify. Well, he escaped. And then he went to the government, and then next thing you know, here comes the raid. They hit the complex, they hit the manor in LA, and then they hit Washington, D.C., and that was the famous 1977 FBI raid.
Right. So Hubbard at that point just took off right away with Dee Dee and Claire, who were Messengers, and Pat Broker. And they went up to Sparks, Nevada, and we covered that whole story. And Mary Sue remained at WHQ, and she took over running things. And then when Hubbard was ready to come back in January of 78, he wouldn't come back until Mary Sue had been relocated to Los Angeles. So a project was happening, and they got Mary Sue a house down in Los Feliz in the LA area. And she got moved and set up there, at which point he came back. So that then, he and Mary Sue throughout that whole period would write letters to each other every day. They didn't wait for an answer. It's like you wrote a letter that day. You might get a letter from 3 days ago, and then you answered that. And they would just update each other on what was going on. And she, in her letters, would talk more and more and more about her case, the legal case. And he found that enturbulating or upsetting. So he had the messengers, whoever was on watch when the letter came in, we had to go through that letter and retype it and take out everything that talked about the case so that he didn't have to read it. And it would just talk about other things that were going on in her life. So while she was located in LA, she would still come up to winter headquarters and see Hubbard every now and again. And they'd still do family gatherings, Anyway, in this photo on the left is Hubbard. And then there's Diana, the oldest daughter, with her daughter, Roanne, and the father of Roanne, John Horwich. And then at the end of the table is Arthur Hubbard, and there's Suzette and Mary Sue.
Now, I have a question quickly about this. That was their first grandchild, right? Roanne was the first grandchild?
Yes, Roanne was the first grandchild.
Do you remember what was Hubbard and Mary Sue? Were they thrilled when they heard that Roanne was born? I mean, do you remember that? Are there any stories about that time?
Well, I wasn't with them at that time, but he did send telexes to make sure things were set up properly for Roanne being born, and having having Diana and John living in the penthouse, which had been labeled as a Hubbard space. And then later on in years, he actually did up what was called the Princess Program. And that was a whole program to have Roanne brought up from Clearwater to SHQ, Summer Headquarters, when we moved to Hemet, or Gilman Hot Springs. Roanne, at 5 years old, was pulled up there, and there was no other kids, so she was taken away from other kids. But Hubbard had written this Princess Program, which was to have a nanny and a tutor and to get her involved in different classes in Hemet. And so she'd go horse riding in Hemet, and she'd go to dance classes in Hemet. And, they were supposed to do auditing on Roanne. And this was during the whole time that Diana and John were going through a divorce. So it became actually John and Hubbard versus Mary Sue and Diana as to what happens with Roanne. And Hubbard wanted Roanne at the base. And even when John got in trouble and he got declared, he was kept at the base to get through his A to E steps of being a suppressive person, because he was the legal guardian of Roanne. And they even took one of the buildings at the Gold Base, and it became the Horwich House, and that's where John and Roanne lived. And then Diana, during that time, ended up marrying John Ryan and took a leave from the Sea Org, and she hung out a lot with Mary Sue at that time. And so Diana was down in LA, and Roanne used to be sent down there every few weeks. She'd have to take the courier bus down to LA and spend the weekend with her mom, and would see Mary Sue during that time period. But, in talking to Roanne years later, there was when Diana rejoined the Sea Org, there was times Diana went down and would visit her mom and wouldn't take Roanne with her, but Mary Sue did. She got to spend time with her grandchildren, with Roanne. And we have a picture of Mary Sue with Tyson, who was Suzette's oldest, and he was actually my godson. I did a terrible job, because when Suzette blew with Tyson, I never saw him again. But I used to keep a picture of him by my bed. I was very proud to be Tyson's godmother.
Yeah, we'll show that picture a little bit later here in the show. But yeah,
okay.
That's good.
Yeah.
You were talking about the letters that Hubbard and Mary Sue wrote to each other, and that you messengers had to type them up to take out any of the
right.
And Theta, the bad news about her court
Yeah,
case.
right. Well, you know, when Hubbard first came back and Mary Sue was gone, my mother passed away about 3 weeks later, two to 3 weeks later after Hubbard got back from Sparks. And I had gone to Clearwater for my mom's funeral, and I came back, and I was back on watch. And how we used to do this, Hubbard would get his letters from Mary Sue, and he'd sit in his chair, and we had a typing table over to the side on the wall, and the messenger would sit there and type his dictation of his replies to Mary Sue. And we used to be able to handwrite them when we'd make up our own shorthand to write fast enough. But here on the letters, he had us just type the letters straight away, and he wouldn't let us, you know, go back and retype them. It was like, no, they're fine as they are. And, you know, they were a mess. Anyway, I remember sitting there. He'd now just gotten a letter from Mary Sue, who had heard about my mother's death. And I've told this story before, where he's dictating and now he's answering Mary Sue and telling her how, well, when I got back here, I only heard about Yvonne being sick. And so I started telexing to find out what was going on, and it was too late to do anything about it. And I remember here I am sitting there typing away, and I'm crying. There was no stopping my emotions on this, you know. I was very raw with her death, and this didn't help. And then it was like as if suddenly Hubbard realized, oh, it's Janis, her daughter, who's sitting there taking this dictation. And he says to me, are you okay? And I'm not going to turn around with tears coming down my face. And, you know, I'm thinking, well, what do I do? If I say this is affecting me, I'm going to get nailed for case on post. And so I did not turn around. I just said, I'm fine. And, you know, so then he continues dictation, and I just held it together to get through the dictation. And I look back on it, and it was one of the cruelest things I think I've had to live through was taking that dictation from Hubbard to Mary Sue about my mother. And another thing that happened while Mary Sue was in Los Angeles, and I know they continued to write their daily letters, is when I went to the RPF, the Rehabilitation Project Force, a few months later that I've talked about. When I was assigned to that, it was said I was going because I rock slammed and had evil purposes on Mary Sue. Anyway, I was refusing to do the RPF, and that's when they locked me up for 11 days. And right. It was during that 11 days that I got a letter from Mary Sue. And so that told me that Hubbard knew I was locked up and I was wanting to leave, because how else would Mary Sue find out? It was right. Just his letters that he got news on different things. So Mary Sue wrote me a letter. And here I am locked up for, you know, by that point, probably 10 days going on 11. And they come in and they give me a letter from Mary Sue. No one was allowed to talk to me or anything. They just hand me the letter, and I look at it and I go, it's from Mary Sue. I could recognize that handwriting anywhere. She never typed. She just wrote in her neat little handwriting everything. Anyway, so I read her letter and I thought about it, and she kind of went into explaining, you know, the Sea Org is for 1 billion years, and what's just a few months in the rehabilitation project? It'll give you time to reflect and to, you know, take a break from, you know, the heavy duties that you've been doing and stuff like that, and, you know, continue to move up the bridge. And this is 3 pages of it. And from that letter is when I decided to stay. And I ended up staying another 11 or 12 years or something ridiculous.
Let me ask you, was that one of the letters that got stolen out of your storage locker when you finally left the Sea Org?
No. That letter, after I got it, it changed my mind to stay. I sent it to my PC folder.
Oh.
because, okay, this is what got me to change my mind. Not
Yeah,
any of the auditing. Yeah.
Right. For our viewers who don't know, a PC folder is a pre-clear folder. It's the folder of all of your processing, your counseling that you got. And so that it was not Janis's property once you put it in there. That Scientology kept it, and it's probably all been shredded by now. Who knows? But
Well, actually, I know there was lawsuits, one where people managed to get their PC photos. They were told it wasn't theirs, but then it was decided in a court it was. So, but it's been so long. I have no idea where my PC photos are, if they're shredded, if they're locked away in a safe somewhere so they can come after me in the future. Who knows?
Yeah.
Well, I was just going to mention that, I kept in a good relationship with Mary Sue. And actually, Hubbard later on made me the, it was IRD, International Relations Director. And that was so that I was the messenger that coordinated between the Sea Org and management and the Guardian's office through Mary Sue, because I had a good relationship with her. And so I did that. And she actually got involved. She was hearing, she still hadn't been removed or anything like that. She was still doing her job, though Snow White stuff was all happening. But she had written to Dee Dee, who was the commanding officer of the Commodore's Messenger Org, and she was running everything internationally while Hubbard was off the lines. And Mary Sue wrote Dee Dee concerned about the monthly buy now.
Price increases.
Price increase. Every month, the prices were increased by 5%, I think it was. And the regs would use that buy now to get people to pay up their money for advanced services. Anyway, Mary Sue was very worried about that and wrote Dee Dee. And Dee Dee already, all of the CMO already had concern about the buy now, because it was just feeling it was getting out of control and there was no end to it. And Hubbard was gone. And okay, should someone make a decision on this? How would Hubbard react when he comes back on the lines and finds out it's been stopped? But with Mary Sue writing Dee Dee about it, it kind of was like, okay, well, Mary Sue will have our back on this. And so Dee Dee put a stop to the buy now. And when Hubbard came back on the lines, he was furious. And that was the start of the demise of Dee Dee being removed from running Scientology. Though it had been doing good with Hubbard gone, that's what took her down, was stopping the buy now.
Right. And Miscavige jumped on all over that and stuff, because the Guardian's office and Mary Sue were criminals. And we're way down the line on this, but this is what happened. There was like, the viewpoint was like Mary Sue, she influenced, Dee Dee to do this, when it actually was the right thing to do.
Right. So,
anyway.
And it was during that time period that I got married to Paul while Mary Sue was off handling all her legal stuff. And I knew I still had a connection with her, because when I sent her a notice, an invitation to my wedding, she wrote me a lovely letter back that she couldn't attend it because she was busy with her, with her legal stuff. And then she says, I'm going shopping for you. And then she sent me a beautiful white negligee, as my bridal shower gift. And then she did gifts with Hubbard. But it was just, I still had that connection with her.
Well, we're going to go into now Snow White a little bit more in detail so that people understand what happened and how she ended up in prison. So I'm just going to read some notes here just off of it, just so to describe what the Snow White program was.
Right.
This is a photograph of Mary Sue. She pleaded. It was a plea agreement with the U.S. government. This was after the FBI raid in 1977, but she didn't actually get convicted until like the early 80s, like 1982 or whatever. So it took a long time where they were fighting the legal case, and they basically stipulated to things that were done so that she would get a lighter sentence and all that. But I'm just going to read this real quick. Operation Snow White was a large-scale covert campaign carried out in the 1970s by Scientology under the direction of its intelligence arm, the Guardian's Office, led by Mary Sue Hubbard, wife of L. Ron Hubbard. Its stated goal inside the organization was to clean up negative reports about Scientology and Hubbard that existed in government files. In practice, it became the largest infiltration of U.S. government in history. Operatives, many of them Scientology members, infiltrated over 100 government agencies, including the Internal Revenue Service, the Department of Justice, U.S. embassies, and foreign governments. They used tactics like breaking into government offices, stealing or copying confidential documents, planting false information in files, wiretapping and bugging offices, using false identities to gain employment inside agencies. The aim was to remove or alter damaging records, identify critics or investigations that were going on, influence legal and tax outcome. And it was uncovered when Michael Meisner, who was one of the main guys in D.C. who was going in and stealing documents, got caught. And then he went over to the FBI, and basically that's how the raid happened, and then all from there. Says Mary Sue Hubbard's role, she was not a low-level participant. She was found to be the head of the Guardian's office, directly overseeing intelligence and legal operations, involved in authorizing or being aware of illegal activities. She was ultimately convicted of conspiracy against the U.S. government, obstruction of justice, and burglary of government offices. Despite being the founder of Scientology, L. Ron Hubbard was not criminally charged in the case. However, prosecutors in court stated there was evidence he had knowledge of or influence over the Guardian's office, and he went into seclusion during the investigation and trial period. Anyway, that was basically it. And then she was sentenced. She fought it for years. She was originally sentenced to 5 years in federal prison for her role in Operation Snow White. After appeals and medical considerations, that sentence was reduced to 4 years with parole eligibility after 40 months. In reality, she served about 1 year in prison before being released, and she was incarcerated at a federal prison in Lexington, Kentucky. And the time of the final appeal was exhausted in 1982, and she began serving her sentence in January 1983. Right, so that's a summary of the details from Wikipedia of it, and it's based off of the actual stipulation that Scientology and that Mary Sue Hubbard signed of the activities that they pled guilty to at that time.
Right. Now, when it was felt that she was going to prison, we were in Hemet at the time, and Hubbard was at X. And he set up a whole thing to meet Mary Sue at the Gold Base up at Bonnie View. And he set up a whole photo shoot to take photos of her so that he had evidence that this is how she looked before she went to jail. And because he was concerned of what would happen to her in prison. So he did a whole photo shoot, so he had evidence. But, she seemed fine in prison. And while she was in prison, I know she wrote to Leon Steinberg and various different friends while she was in there. And the whole time she still kept up her belief and loyalty to Hubbard, her husband. She was still very loyal to him and protective of him.
Yeah, she never turned. I mean, she could have very easily done a plea deal and said, well, my husband is actually the one who wrote the program and got it going in the early 1970s, but she never did that. Right.
But, the way that program was written, it did not call for criminal activity. It called to work out a way, to find the false reports and replace with the correct reports. So.
And then did you say? You said in the last video too, the way they caught Mary Sue is because she hand wrote everything, and they found that red box, right? Yeah,
right. But as a messenger, Hubbard would call us in, or would come right back from a message run, and we'd just walk into wherever they were maybe eating, and talking. And Mary Sue always would shut up when we would come in. So I always suspected she's briefing him on something the Guardian's office had going that she didn't want us to know about.
He was in Hemet at the apartment in X, just outside of Golden Era Studios or whatever at the time. And I forget exactly. Now, he took off with Pat and Annie That was the last time that he and Mary Sue saw each other physically, was that time that they came up to Bonneview and they took all those photographs you mentioned, and for that birthday party, because when she went to prison, he was gone. I mean, none of us knew where he was, right?
Right. Yeah, we didn't know where he was. But yeah, what got her involved or convicted was the letters that she hand wrote, because she didn't type, and those Henning Helt was the one who had those in that little red box that got turned over or found by the FBI raid. Yeah. But
my point is that was the last time Hubbard saw her and she saw him, even though he lived, till 1986. Like, he took off in 79 or 80, whatever it was.
He took off in 80, early 80, around March 80.
Nobody saw him till he died in 1986. So basically that was the last time they saw him. But I'm sure they probably wrote letters back and forth, right, while he was gone?
Yeah, they did. I've heard that they did write letters back and forth. Yeah. But as time went by, his attitude, from what I could see, was turning more sour and more sour. But that's not something new with Hubbard, because if you look at everyone that was close to him and helped him, and it gets to a point where he no longer has that loyalty, that returned loyalty. It happened with Ken Urquhart. It happened with David Mayo. It happened with myself. It happened with Mary Sue. It happened with Fred Sharp.
Well, that was the thing that I noticed when we finally left, and I read Barefaced Messiah by Russell Miller, that book, was I noticed the pattern that it went all the way back to the 1950s. The people who started Wichita with him and did all this stuff, they were his biggest benefactors. Then they were the enemy, and he was turning them into the J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI as communists. You know what I mean? So it sounded like you're my best friend, until not anymore. Then you're my deepest, darkest enemy. Yeah,
that's correct.
Yeah. And I remember too, I mean, the viewpoint from Miscavige and all that during that time after she went to prison and then got out, was that, Mary Sue's like, she can't be involved with anything. We're keeping her away. And she was responsible for all this crap with the government and all that sort of stuff. And so she was basically persona non grata, right? I mean, she was like hands off.
Well, it was like, she can't be an executive anymore because she's got a criminal history. So she doesn't qualify. So she was not allowed anywhere near the Guardian's office or OSA or any Scientology stuff. Though, according to Chuck Beatty, she did have a in-basket to receive traffic from Hubbard. So that there was stuff going back and forth. Yeah. But and when he passed away, he left her the house. There's certain things he left for her.
I'm going to show that. But my point is that she was persona non grata, and the viewpoint was, all the Guardian's office people, they're all criminals, right? Remember?
Right.
But then Miscavige, all he did was just reorganize it into the Office of Special Affairs, and they continued to do dirty stuff, dirty tricks. They never been indicted. They didn't infiltrate the government like the Guardian's office did, but they still were a dirty organization. It never was cleaned up.
They still, dirty tricks is what they did.
Now let me show this is the photograph of the home that Mary Sue, that the Hubbard bought for her in Los Feliz, right? And that's an aerial view of it. And this is from a few years ago. There's a picture of the home there, and then also the backyard with the swimming pool. And this is where she lived until she passed away in 2002. And she was just living her life there. But she had minders the whole time she was there, right? She had Neville and Leslie Potter and Ginny Hoff, and they wrote reports. I know that Neville did, to Miscavige, daily reports. What was Mary Sue up to? Because we found that out because Bruce Hines was sent to, he later became her auditor, and we did a video of him. He was auditor for Mary Sue Hubbard and Nicole Kidman, and you can find that video if you're interested in it on our channel. I'll actually put it in the playlist on the Mary Sue Hubbard interviews if you want to find it to our viewers out there. But she was basically kept under control, right?
Yeah, she had, Neville and Leslie Potter. Mostly Neville was her auditor originally. Mm-hmm. And some people would know Neville because he did the release of Ned for OT's Knots. He did that mission to release it at the Flag Service Org. But Neville and Leslie were there, and then Ginny Hoff and Het Sanderson were there, and they all lived with Mary Sue. And when Mary Sue passed away, she actually, from what I was told, she released like Ginny and Het from their SEAL contract. Neville became her trustee, but he was the one that was mostly reporting on her, and she knew that. So she knew to only certain things would she tell him or let him know about and be a part of. But, you know, all her kids would visit her at that house. Diana would visit her. Suzette, by that time, had 3 kids, and Suzette would show up with the grandkids. There's Mary Sue on the left with Tyson. That's my godson. And there's Suzette with her husband at that time, Guy White. But the kids did come, and so she did have those happy moments, and definitely you would get down on the floor with the grandkids and had fun with them.
Yeah. Now, one thing I was going to say too, I mean, also we covered, you know, Bruce Hines in the interview that we did with him. He doesn't go into Mary Sue's case or anything like that or what came up.
Right.
But he did tell us stories about the fact that Mary Sue hated David Miscavige. I mean, with a passion.
Oh,
Yeah. Also, when Hubbard died in 1986, and the will came out, which became, you know, a lot of people contested. Was it real? Did Elrich really sign it, you know, a few days before he died and all that sort of stuff? He left $100,000 apiece to the kids. And then Mary Sue got the house and $300,000. Like, it was a ridiculously low amount when he had, you know, 150, 200 million. I forget what it was. I think it was like $250 million in his estate. Right. And that he was going to give to the Church of Spiritual Technology. Right. But they had to get her to sign that she would not challenge the will. And so they showed up, Miscavige, Mark Yeager, Ray Midoff, Norman Starkey, Jesse Prince, all these top Scientology executives showed up at her house there in Los Feliz, all dressed in their Class A Sea Org uniforms, and basically forced her to sign, you know, put her under mental anguish to sign that paper, which she did sign. And as Bruce told us, the one thing he did say that he could say was that Mary Sue asked, her biggest thing was she wanted to ask if LRH had asked about her or said anything about her before he passed away. And Ray Midoff, who was there, said, no, he didn't. Basically coldly said that he didn't give a shit about you anymore. I mean, to be honest with you. And I'm sure that had to be really hard for her, because I don't believe that that's the case. I mean, she basically stood by him till the end, you know?
Yeah, and you don't know what Hubbard had said to Annie or to Pat. Right. Ray was there to audit Hubbard, you know, to do his final goodbye auditing, you know, to help him leave his body using, you know, Scientology technology. But so Ray wasn't there with him all the time, but you don't know what was said to Pat or Annie. But I know all the years that I was with them, you know, she is the one who would work to calm him down and talk common sense into him. It's, you know, an example of that is on disconnection. Mm-hmm. You know, Hubbard would keep bringing up disconnection to get the SPs, the suppressive persons, off the lines. But Mary Sue would say, you know, all that would do is create further problems. And so that's when he finally said, there's no more disconnection. We have the technology to handle people. We don't need to disconnect. And that was from Mary Sue pushing that point, because all it did was create further problems with family members. And then you look at today, it's all totally screwed up, and it's no longer a, you know, fair roads, fair weather type of letters to your family. No one communicates to their family anymore. They just totally disconnect and want nothing to do with the outside world. But how are you going to clear the planet if you're not going to communicate with the outside world? Right.
And we're not trying to paint a rosy picture about Mary Sue. The positives are that she was extremely loyal to her husband till the day she died, until the day he died. Do you know what I mean? I mean, she was completely loyal to her kids and to Hubbard. And she did protect Scientology and Hubbard through the 60s and 70s. I mean, whatever was going on, I mean, they had to constantly be moving from port to port and nation to nation because he was under attack, and they were being investigated and being harassed by the U.S. government and other governments. So, you know, whether or not you believe in Scientology or not, or whether or not you think it's a cult or not, or anything like that, that's the story of Mary Sue. She was devoted to her husband, and she believed in Scientology, and she was believed in her children and her grandchildren and stuff, you know. And if anybody could handle Hubbard, she was the one, you know what I mean? She stuck with him for a long time. Yeah.
Now, you know, an interesting thing is when her days were coming to an end, she actually, you know, she left money for all her kids, and the house was to be divided up, sold and divided up amongst the kids, the money from that. But there was a stipulation that the house could not be sold until her dog had passed away. So because the dog was now older and, you know, and being cared for and knew nothing else but this house. But the dog just kept living and living and living. And one of the grandkids made a comment about how the dog, they must be switching out the dog in order to stretch out the time of having to sell the house. But then anyway,
and this was not Vixie. This was not Vixie, the dog on the Sea Org or anything like that. This is another dog later.
Yeah, she after Vixie on the ship, she got Yama and Tashi, and I'm sure they were dead by then, and there was probably other dogs. But anyway, the grandkids would joke about how they must be switching out the dog because the dog just wouldn't die so that they could sell the house.
Well, if you want more details and info inside about the Sea Organization and the Hubbards and L. Ron Hubbard and the Messengers, you usually need to buy Janis's book, Commodore's Messenger. This is book 1. That's her when she was like 12 or 13. I think she's 13 years old there with Hubbard on the Apollo. Right. And then book 2 is right here. And there she is there in Setúbal, did you say?
Yes. Setúbal in Portugal.
Yeah. Janis spent 6 hours a day, 7 days a week for Hubbard all through her teenage years, and was probably, her and the other messengers, closer to Hubbard than just about anybody. Mary Sue obviously was close to him, as we've gone over in this video. But anyway, if you're interested in photographs and more stories and more information, you can order both of those books. This is book 2 and this is book 1. Just go down into our video description. There's a link to our merchandise store where you could just click on it and you'll get an autographed copy from Janis of either one of the books, and you could buy them and she'll send them to you in the United States. Or the audio book is available on, well, the books are available on Amazon, but the audio book's also available on Amazon, right? For book 1. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So anyway, they're really great. If you're interested at all in Scientology and Sea Organization, you have to have them because they're great references as well. And a lot of the photos that we show on our videos are included in those books. So, and someday we'll get the book 3 and all that. But we've told a lot of stories on our channel that'll probably eventually end up in book 3 as well.
That's right.
Anyway, I want to mention, if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button. Please hit that notification button. It helps to get our videos out to other people. We appreciate the support on that. If you have any questions or comments, please go down below. We got a lot of questions and comments on part 1 of this video and a lot of positive feedback. But if you have other questions or anything like that, please go down. We're definitely interested in them and we will respond to you. If you'd like to support our channel, you can buy us a coffee. Again, in the video description, you just go in there. There's a link where you can support us. There are minor expenses for the channel, and it helps us to pay those and keep these videos going. And we appreciate any support that we get from our loyal viewers. That's what we got today, Janis. Have you got anything else you'd like to say?
No, I don't. I've pretty much covered everything. And
anyway, everybody, until the next time, we'll say bye-bye.
Bye.